The superior quality of the T-34's armour, mobility, speed and gunpowder was something they simply hadn't suspected. Guderian himself ran into a T-34 ambush in November 1941, and his force was almost completely destroyed.
Guderian was pushing forward to Moscow and had swung round from the south and was approaching Tula. And for the first time he was met not by one or two T-34 tanks, but a perfectly organized, competently commanded Soviet tank brigade, commanded by a man called Katukov. And this is where the Germans really learned what the T-34 could do. And the alarm bells rang throughout Germany, and for the first time one began to see how these tank forces could be handled.
But it wasn't just the quality of the tanks which counted. It was the capability of the panzer commanders to control their armour that was essential. They had excellent command control facilities, and also at that time they had very good support and logistical facilities. So that although German Mark II and Mark IIIs might run up against a huge KV-1, the big heavy tank, such was the haphazard and untrained manner in which the Russians handled their armour that the Germans soon learned to defeat them, even with inferior armour. But there were a few hard lessons to be learnt first. One of these was the emergence of the KV-1. After a month of victorious progress, the German High Command were disconcerted by the rapidity of their own advance. Their armies were now fighting on a front 1,000 miles wide. The Stukas could no longer deliver the concerted hammer blows which had punched the holes in the Russian lines, which the panzers had so mercilessly exploited. The lengthening supply lines were also affecting the German ground forces. Tank commanders, hundreds of miles from their Polish depots, nevertheless pressed for the final thrust towards Moscow. They argued that only the continuation of the offensive would prevent the Russians from organizing a fresh line of resistance. While many of Hitler's generals disagreed that such an attack should be launched immediately, they were almost unanimous in recommending that Moscow should become the primary objective of the next phase of the war. Hitler, on the other hand, was worried about the possibility of the gaps between the panzer divisions and the main armies being exploited by Russian reinforcements. Hitler had never been fully convinced of the importance of Moscow and continued to regard it as a secondary objective. The debate stretched out until mid-August. A vital month of summer weather was wasted. The Russians had the breathing space to throw reserve divisions into the gaps in their defences. Barely trained, poorly equipped, some in the battered remnants of their civilian clothing, their stubborn ferocity meant that they were still a force to be reckoned with. A rapid campaign to crush Russia, which should have been over by August, had not achieved its objectives. The German High Command had to think again, and the first thing that they had to think about was logistics and supplies. No great preparation had been made for a winter campaign in Russia. Neither were their tanks equipped for the job in hand. Eventually, the objections of the generals were overruled, and not one but two major objectives were prioritized by Hitler, who demanded the simultaneous capture of Moscow and the fall of the Ukraine. He decided that the General Heinz Guderian and his 2nd Panzer Group should be diverted south to assist the German army group fighting there, instead of concentrating on the final drive towards Moscow. With hindsight, it was to prove a disastrous intervention, although at the time Hitler appeared to have been vindicated. As seen here, in the newsreels of the time, Guderian and his tanks were able to penetrate deep into Soviet territory. They were to contribute to the huge victory when they combined with the panzer forces of Army Group South, under von Kleist, to produce a stunning encirclement which produced a vast haul of prisoners. This footage shows the link-up between the tanks of Guderian, with the white G, and von Kleist, whose vehicles are marked with the white K. It was not just in the ranks of the German army that strategic errors were being made, as the Russians too made some costly blunders. The giant pincer movement involving half of Army Group Centre and the left flank of Army Group South began to close its jaws on a huge pocket of Russian forces to the rear of Kiev. Field Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet Chief of Staff, pleaded with Stalin for a strategic withdrawal of the troops defending the city. He was dismissed from his post. Marshal Timoshenko, the newly appointed Southwest commander, arrived just in time to see the trapped Soviet divisions march into captivity. With the help of Panzer Group II from Army Group Center, von Kleist's Panzer Group I was able to complete the encirclement of a further huge pocket of dazed Russian prisoners outside Kiev. This time, a staggering 650,000 men marched into captivity. Army Group South had played its part in the largest victory in history. The unfortunate captives had nothing to celebrate. The 650,000 prisoners taken by the Germans remains the highest number ever captured in a single engagement. The battle for the Ukraine now centered on the Crimean Peninsula, where the right flank of Army Group South pressed the Soviet 51st Army back towards Sebastopol. While half of the German Group Center were engaged in subduing the Ukraine, Marshal Zhukov, transferred to the reserve forces behind West Front, seized the opportunity to attack the German Fourth Army. Occupying a salient near Smolensk, the Germans were now themselves vulnerable to encirclement. The German Fourth Army were thrown back 12 kilometers, but without sufficient tanks and aircraft, Zhukov failed to tighten the noose he had made. However, in terms of morale, Zhukov's counter-thrust was highly significant. His action was the first substantial Soviet counterattack of the war. The advance to Moscow was resumed at the end of September, but the delay proved to be fatal. Fuel and supplies were delivered through a system that had become frequently inefficient, if not corrupt, and the lines of communication were enormously overextended. Shortages of every kind impaired the fighting ability of the frontline forces. The vague fears of the generals, who had initially harbored doubts, were beginning to take the shape of a massive problem. The advance had been over areas so vast that it was impossible for comprehensive mopping-up operations to be undertaken. Behind the Germans, there lay the huge expanses of territory in which tens of thousands of Red Army troops roamed uncaptured. Blitzkrieg's lifeblood was rapid movement, and the spearheads were now being reduced to a perilously slow crawl.
There was something seriously wrong with the Blitzkrieg technique. It didn't fit in Russia. From the Soviet side, they began to realize that there were these shortcomings in the German Blitzkrieg approach, and that the first job that the Russians had to do at immense cost was actually to halt this, to stop the Blitzkrieg, literally to stop its movement. This was a very difficult lesson they had to learn. And the first thing was that they really had, this was a very painful lesson for them, they really had to learn the lessons of active and effective defense. It was no good setting up a system of constant and continued counterblows and counterattacks. All that happened there was you simply incurred very heavy casualties, and you really didn't do anything as the Germans regrouped and reorganized.
The autumn rains were heavy. In France, there had been metalled roads. Here, the highways were vanishing into impassable tracts of mud in which men, vehicles and horses floundered more and more helplessly. Breakdowns increased, and repairs became extremely difficult to carry out.
One of the disadvantages of a tank like the Panzer III can be seen down here in the tracks. Compared to the T-34, for example, they're comparatively narrow, and the reason for that is that these machines were designed with Western Europe in mind. The Great War was still fresh in the minds of everybody who was designing these tanks, and as a consequence no one had really given serious consideration to the possibility that they might have to operate in Russia. And when they did, particularly in the winter of 1941, it came as a severe surprise to the German to find that the conditions were just so extreme.